Awesome. All right. So let's get going. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for the third edition of the Fireside Chat. My name is Garrett McLaughlin. I'm a strength conditioning coach and athletic trainer in West Bloomfield, Michigan. So for those of you who are new to the Fireside Chat, this is a conversational type webinar where we connect with some of the top professionals in the running industry. This week, we have no one other than Dr. Jesse Riley, who is a sports chiropractor and running specialist in Golden, Colorado. Before we get started, let me cover a few housekeeping items first. Do me a favor, silence any technology around you. I want to make sure you get the most from this content today. I know we have a lot of, been browsing through the PowerPoint here over the last couple of days. A lot of great, really good information that I think you guys can benefit from. So I want to make sure you get the most of that. Second, I highly recommend asking questions. Of course, there are specific items that we want to cover directly in the, here. 1 second, there we go. So there are specific items that we will cover in the Fireside Chat, but at any point, if you have questions for Dr. Riley, drop a question in that chat box below, whether it's footwear related, running related, injury related. Can hopefully use this time to get you or give you as much value as possible. And then lastly, if you cannot stay for the entire Fireside Chat, we completely understand. I will be sending a replay of the chat tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern time. Also know that those of you that signed up before about 5 p.m., I already emailed you a interactive PDF that he put together with some great information, links to several different videos and pieces of content for you to reference that we'll go over a little bit in more detail in this chat today. So without further ado, Dr. Riley, thank you for joining us for this Fireside Chat. How's everything going this evening?
Not too bad, Garrett. It's good to see you again. It's always good to catch up.
Good to see you too. And for those of you on here, Dr. Riley and I was in Nashville, Tennessee, and as of last year, but we crossed paths while in Nashville. And just to give people a little context, tell them a little bit about you, where you're from, where you've been, where are you now?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people tend to call me Dr. Riley or Coach Riley, and that's kind of the first point of the topic there. I'm aware of many hats. I kind of study a lot of my mentors, I would say. One of them is Philip Snell. He's a chiro out of Portland area, and he always talks about whatever hat you're going to wear is what you're going to walk into the room with. And so for me, our approach should always be catered to the individual that we work with. And so that's what I kind of mean by that. I'll get into a little bit more detail in the third point when I talk about that. But as far as where I'm from, grew up in southeastern Illinois. So I always say I grew up around cornfields, but I was not a farmer. Went to school out in kind of St. Louis area and ended up in LA for about a year doing an internship there. That took me to Nashville, where I worked for 4 years or so. Like Garrett said, that's where we kind of crossed paths. And then now currently living in Denver, work out of Golden. They're pretty close together. As far as my treatment approach, that's kind of the hat part wearing thing. We call it the biopsychosocial approach. So perfect example of that may be someone who is a runner who may have biomechanical needs that might need to have work being done on them, but you have to remember that that is a person also. So they're going to have some anxieties or maybe some fear behavior that's associated with this problem. And that's kind of my job to help dissect a little bit of that, see which parts I can help, see which parts I may need to have someone else help with, and us lay out a strategy so that that person feels like they can get back to where they were or where they need to go. And as far as the how I run things, a lot of what I do is all based around kind of movement behavior. So I can see that on an iPad doing a recording and stuff like that. And a lot of our basis is based around that. One concept that you guys will hear a lot from me is I talk about the balance of what is load. So that's just how much stress or strain we place on a particular area or a whole body. And there's that balance on the other side that's called capacity. And that's just how much load can that area take in a given amount of time. And with runners especially, we often run into injury, right? I think one of the best quotes is from Chris Johnson. He's a PT out of Seattle area. And he said, the best way to prevent injury as a runner is to not run. And obviously it's being facetious, but at the same time, like we're always going to have some type of injury that we might run into in our training sessions. And so it's just a means of how can we find that balance? And it's going to, you know, relate to the topic we're talking about today: shoes, training plans, sleep. I mean, you name it. This is why Garrett's so good at what he does. And then we'll get into later on. Obviously, COVID has kind of thrown everybody a curveball. And so, you know, for the most part, Garrett and I, we've always been used to kind of working face to face with people, but in this day and age, that has been a little harder. And so we've kind of adopted our principles to accommodate. And so it's been actually kind of cool. It's been a nice, like, learning experience to hone in on my online consultation visits a little bit more and kind of refine that. And lastly, I would say my main kind of populations that I work with are, and I kind of use this as a joke, endurance athletes, and then chronic persistent pain people. And oftentimes they're one and the same. They're pretty interchangeable.
So just to give people a little context here. So I think it was about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, I always follow your Instagram. I feel like it's a good mix of educational content. It's funny. Like you just want to continue to engage and look at the videos and images and just read the captions that you have there. And you had a really good series on footwear. So that's why I approached you here, hoping to get the audience and we can get some information out regarding footwear in the running shoe industry, because I think there's a lot of confusion around that. So could you just start by providing just some basic education and value to teach people some of the key things they need to know in regards to footwear?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would even start by saying this, guys, like, as long as you have general principles and a foundational level of knowledge, then you're already light years ahead of the general population in terms of shoes. And so that was kind of the intent of this presentation. And then also the handout you're going to get is I want you guys to walk away with a good enough base of knowledge that next time there's not that anxiety that we feel with, like, oh my God, is this the right shoe for me? Like, this person's trying to sell me this shoe. And I think that's a lot of what we run into, right? Is we want the coolest shoe, the newest shoe, or the one that's going to make us run like super fast, right? And so having a firm base of knowledge right off the bat is going to give you a lot more comfortability into knowing what that is. So when we talk about some of these anatomical terms of the shoe, when we talk about stack height, that's the first one we'll go over. Essentially what we're going over is, and I'll kind of hold up my own shoe here, is I'm talking about the space between basically the sole of the shoe and where your foot meets, okay? And so a perfect example of that, of a huge disparity between the two, is on one end, this is where like the minimalist shoe craze came into play, because there is very minimal amount of stack height. There's not a whole lot between your foot and the ground, essentially. On the contrasting other end, though, we have what's called the maximalist type shoe. And that's going to be something more like, you know, your Hokas and some of those OG Hokas, like, whoa, there is a ton of stack height there. So that's what we kind of mean when we talk about stack height. So when you guys are looking for something that maybe is like a lightweight or a speed type shoe, you're probably going to have less stack height. Whereas something that you might want to have a little more cushion with, and you may take on your longer runs, that might be something that's closer to that higher stack height. Next big thing that I think is pretty important is what's called shoe drop. Essentially what that is, guys, is most shoes for the most part have a higher heel than they do at the toe. And so there's an angle that kind of slopes down. And sometimes we have to take that into consideration if you're riding a shoe that's got like a 12 millimeter drop, and we'll go into this later on, your next shoe, it would be highly suggested for you to not go into something that is a 0 millimeter drop shoe, because that's just a pretty big disparity between the two. And so when we talk about that, all that is just the amount of angle that is from the heel to the toe. Toe box width, that's going to be probably your next big anatomical term. This is going to appeal more to the ultra crowd. So a shoe like an Ultra Escalante is going to have a wider toe box width because that's kind of their marketing scheme. They have a natural foot type. And for the most part, yeah, like you do want a little bit of room in your toe box width, but don't make that mistake that this is the shoe for you because you have that. There's a lot of shoes that can kind of accommodate for that too. And then the last few pieces that you see here, guys, is you see kind of the upper of the shoe. That's more of going to be your knit type material. You just want to make sure that that kind of hugs the foot well, kind of keeps it secure as well, kind of in that back heel collar. The midsole, that's going to be more of kind of like a rubber synthetic material. This is where you're going to run into where like a stability shoe that may have any type of pronation control. That's where that's going to be. And then your outsole is kind of where the traction and all that is. And then the last few pieces are just rear foot, midfoot, forefoot. And most of you are going to appeal to that with your foot strike pattern of how your foot hits the ground initially.
So I have a question here from Leah. Do you recommend zero drop shoes? And is there a, I guess, specific runner foot type that you would kind of push in that direction?
Yeah, absolutely. To initially answer the question, it depends. And I know that that is a gray area, but hey, every good doctor is never going to give you a clear-cut answer in the first place. So the reason I would be against it is mainly based if you are not used to that type of shoe, then we definitely want to make sure that there is a long learning curve ahead of time before you go out into your heavier efforts. Main reason being is that shoe with a zero drop is going to load more of your calf and foot, a considerable amount more than a traditional neutral running shoe, and definitely something that's going to have like a 12 millimeter drop, like a Brooks Ghost or something like that. And so when we go from something like, again, like a Brooks Ghost into that Ultra Escalante, again, we'll use this as the example, that's going to overload that calf and foot. And so now we kind of run into things like Achilles problems or plantar fascia problems or anything down kind of in, again, that calf foot level. If I was going to suggest it for someone, it would probably be someone who has had either experience with like track flats or something like that, or maybe some racer shoes. And I already feel like they have like a pretty endurant calf complex. And the other thing would be maybe if they're more of a forefoot striker already, that might be the other reason, because if you're going to be a forefoot striker, you're already kind of naturally loading those areas a little bit higher than anything else up the chain too. So that would be my answer to that question.
Awesome. I actually have a few questions already in here. So just so you guys know that I've already put questions in, some of these I will ask during, others we'll get to in the Q&A just to make sure we get through all the content as well. But next question here. Let's see what's most specific. So Yukio asked, are there shoe brands with a wide toe box you kind of mentioned for people who have bunions? So thinking kind of along those lines.
Yeah, so I would definitely suggest it for anybody who has had any problems in the past with bunion issues or neuromas, like a Morton's neuroma kind of situation. Anything to where you feel like, and we'll get into the test of kind of how to suss that out here in just a little bit, but any reason where you feel like that your foot is just being very much compressed in the shoe means you might need to start looking into more of a wider toe box kind of situation. And so offhand, I know that Ultra does. The problem with them, and this is where, Garrett, if you had $1 million, I'd say, hey, let's just quit our day jobs, is we could start a shoe company that had wider toe box and somewhere in between like 8 to 4 millimeter drop. Technically, you probably could put like a little piece of like cork under the heel to elevate that heel up a little bit. But at the same time too, like another company called Topo Athletics, they're another company that does a wider toe box, and I think they're in like a 3 to 4 millimeter drop range. Again, if you're not used to having that lesser a drop, then we might need a shoe that kind of gets you some kind of in between, basically, is what I'm trying to say, the middleman.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Yeah, guys, feel free to keep dropping questions. I know we have a few of those in there already waiting for us, but I'll wait till we get through a little more content to ask those. So, yeah, if you can kind of talk about, so looking at actually the running shoe industry now, all these different types of shoes and things, and a lot of things that are thrown out there, I think confuse people, but also people gravitate to like, I need that because of this. So could you just clarify some of those?
Big time. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even just growing up, you and I'm sure both can remember like, what does this shoe mean? And what does this shoe do versus this shoe? And then we got pronators and supinators and like all these crazy terms that the general population doesn't really ever need to know. I'm kind of happy with a little bit of where it's kind of went to now. I feel like back in the day, it was all about, again, kind of pronation. And then we had the Vibram 5-finger shoe craze for a while where everybody was going completely minimalist. And then the maximalist scene kind of took off where everybody's going in getting the Hokas and stuff like that. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think it's always going to be that way to some degree. Now it's the 4% and the shoes that are going to cut time off your PRs and stuff like that. At the end of the day, guys, the biggest things that we need to know is obviously the shoe types in regards to the terrain that you're going to be going. So, you know, road, trail, and then anywhere in between, like a racing flat or track flats or something like that. And then from there, I kind of subdivided into basically neutral shoes, which for the most part, that is roughly, I have there 80% of what the shoe population is. And I do want to throw this out here. This is like a soft marketing. Anytime you guys ever need information on shoes, I strictly just go to runningwarehouse.com and they have great stats already lined up for practically every shoe. In fact, most of the time, that's how I find out most of the information in terms of the drops and stuff like that. I'll have somebody come in and they'll say, oh, I'm running in this. Like, do I need to be running in this? And so we'll do our exam. And then, you know, I'll have a few other follow-up questions that we'll talk about here in a second. But that's usually where I pull most of my information from. And so neutral shoes are one, stability shoes are kind of the next one. And when you think about a stability shoe in this day and age, that's just going to be more of a stiffer shoe. Especially when we think about like your Asics and Mizunos, those are usually two pretty popular stability type shoes. And when we go over some of the tests, I'll kind of describe the difference there too. Those are usually the two big ones that I talk about. Is again, we kind of talked about what the maximalist and minimalist type shoes are. That's usually going to be catered around their stack height. And then shoe drop, for example, and this is all just based on self exploration, is that most shoe companies tend to fall within a range. And so the ones that I use there, like Brooks, for example, are there shoes that are less than 12 millimeter drops that are Brooks? Absolutely. But I would say the general majority of their shoes are going to be within like 9 to 12 millimeter drop. Nikes, for the most part, are going to be kind of up there. There's a few. I think there's like a Trail Pegasus that's in like the 4 to 6 range. Saucony is going to be more on the lower end. It's going to be like 3 to 5 or 6. So most shoe companies, for the most part, are going to fall within a range of most of the drop stuff. Toe box width, again, Ultras are the ones that everybody knows about. Topo Athletics are another kind of wider toe box brand. You can typically sometimes find, and this is based on just what I've seen with clients, some people like Brooks because they feel like they are a little bit wider. I have not bought any pair of Brooks myself, so I can't answer that, but I definitely know for a fact Ultra, because I have I've done Escalantes and I've done their Lone Peak for their trail, and both of them, yeah, roomy toe box. You're going to feel like it's a completely different world in terms of putting your foot into that shoe compared to something that's a little more cramped.
And so I think something we might touch on in a second as far as the variability in shoes and alternating shoe drops. We had a question, what about going from zero drop to a shoe with some drop or alternating shoe drops?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question. One of the things we'll get into is I think that you're allotted a little bit of wiggle room. And so just me personally, because there's not a whole lot of research that says, hey, this is the set parameters. I usually try to stay within like no more than 5 millimeter difference. So in saying that, like I will sometimes run in some Escalantes, which are 0 millimeter drop, but here I've got my Saucony Kinvara 11s, and I think that they're like 4 or 5 millimeter drop. And so I actually like these more. I do feel like the Escalantes are actually a little bit more wiggly, like they're not more secure. And I think a lot of that just comes down to with the cushion that they have in the sole themselves. And it's a knit top, so it kind of moves around a little bit more. So I like kind of having a little bit more of a secure feel. So if it's going to be a shorter run, then I'll throw on the Escalantes because I don't really feel like it's going to impair me too much later on. I'm not going to pay the cost. And so when you guys are kind of warming up to it, if you're going from a 0 into another shoe, I always say, hey, give yourself a little bit of a grace period here. I always say, if we're trying a new shoe, let's make sure we wear it just like running errands for a little while before we start going into, especially like a long run training session.
Awesome. Okay, so when it comes to actually purchasing these shoes, what are the different fundamentals or things that are checklists that you like to run through to make sure people are purchasing the right pairs?
Absolutely. I probably could stretch this out to more rules, but I felt like 6 was enough. So the first rule for me is, and I say this with every runner, is you have to make sure the shoe actually feels good. I feel, again, all too often, I feel like we're pressured in the sense that we're a runner, therefore we have to look the part. And so whether that's buying 4% to go out on your runs or whatever the next shoe craze may be, don't pick a shoe based on all of that. Make sure the shoe actually feels good on your foot too. And it kind of goes in well with rule number 2 in the fact of it's kind of reiterating the first point, but I kind of finish with saying what's worked well in the past. Again, I feel like we all too often kind of abandon ship on a shoe. And sometimes, obviously, shoe companies do change their models and stuff can kind of change from year to year. But oftentimes, they don't necessarily abandon an entire concept of a shoe. And so what I mean by that is you're often going to find next year when they put out a shoe, they may put this shoe that may have similar characteristics to the shoe that you had before. And then they may have this other shoe that may do some of the other pieces that are missing from that shoe. So this is where going to Running Warehouse and kind of asking around with some of the affiliates at like a running store that are knowledgeable about that sort of stuff, they can kind of help guide you and direct you a little bit better, okay? Third rule for me is I think at the end of the day, we're going to end up finding out that doing one thing all the time is usually what leads to injury the most. And so training variability is a huge concept that I have with not just my runners, but I'm just talking general population too. We often do the same stinking workout all the time. And that is one of the biggest mistakes we could possibly make. This is why runners have speed days or a long run or maybe a tempo run. There's variability in that. And the reason being is your body doesn't like doing the same thing every day. I was actually thinking about this on the way to work today. I don't want to make my work sound like it's bad, but I think everybody has that sense of a Monday when you're driving to work and you're like, ugh, back at it again. It's a Monday. And your body can feel that too. And so if we don't have that variability to kind of change things up, it's going to start barking at you with problems, whether that's at your patellofemoral joint or your calf and Achilles or wherever it may be. And so there was a study, I believe it was in 2015, ended up finding that people who wore 2 different types of shoes actually had a 39% decrease in of potential injury in their running. Reason being is it's just changing how your foot and the rest of your body is interacting with the ground based on the dynamics of the shoe. So obviously we know not every shoe is the exact same. And so as long as we kind of stay in that sweet spot of that sweet zone, you're not going to get hurt and your body's going to benefit from it too. Rule number 4 is, I think we've kind of talked about this just a little bit. We want to make sure that they're not wildly different. I was on Running Warehouse, I think this past weekend or Friday. I was working on some notes and I was looking up Newtons. So I was like, man, I haven't heard of Newton shoes in forever. And I think there's all of like 2 models left. And I don't even know if they're current. But Newton shoes, if you guys know, they were mainly trying to capture the crowd that were into forefoot strike. And this was kind of when Born to Run came out and everybody was saying, oh, you got a forefoot strike. That's the way, that's how you run, that sort of thing. Pro tip, it doesn't matter. But the Newton shoes kind of had this little piece built up on the forefoot to kind of help push you off with that. And so what I mean by that is you don't want to get a shoe that is that and then drop into, again, maybe like a Hoka that has a considerable amount of stack height and then drop as well. So you want to try to keep them relatively similar. And that's why I always say, hey guys, do your research, go into Running Warehouse. There's nothing on there that you are going to walk away with thinking like I didn't learn anything from my shoe that I bought. Okay. 5th one, I would say always fit the shoe to your longest toe. And so I'm going to say that even in terms of like, hey, if my left second toe is even longer than my biggest toe or my second toe on my right foot, that's the shoe that size you're going to accommodate for your foot. There's not a whole lot of wide variability in terms of like people having drastically different sized feet is what I'm trying to get at there. So always go based on that. And then what I was going to say is this is even where if you don't know your true shoe size, this is where I might suggest going to a running store and getting fitted. They're going to put you into that, it's called a Brannick device, where you put your heel into that little metal thing and then they measure it to your longest toe. And so I always suggest do that because at the end of the day, if that guy is taking a lot of pressure as he's driving into the shoe, you could be doing more harm than good. And so that's why we always fit it to the longest toe. And then also last point on that one is most of the time our feet swell throughout the course of the day. That's just because as we're moving around, blood is going to settle at the bottom of our body. So another little tip is I usually suggest to have people fitted at the end of the day as opposed to right at the start of the day. Is it a wide difference? No, but enough to where it might make a difference. And then the last rule is simply, guys, test them. I feel all too often because now most people are ordering them online that we feel like we have to keep them. No, most places have a great return policy. And this is why I always say, if you're testing a new shoe, go out and walk around the neighborhood, test it out a little bit, run some errands on it. I want you guys to feel like 100% confident that this is your shoe. Otherwise, why are we wasting our money and our time trying to make it work for us?
Right. Yeah, and just so as we move on here, just so you know, we do have a loyal Newton fan there. Tammy said, "I love my Newton," so I'll leave it at that as we move on here.
Tammy, let people know where they can get Newtons at. It ain't Running Warehouse.
All right, so really interested in getting into the self-assessment portion. Have my shoe ready here to test and to look at, and hopefully you can show us some things. I think especially leaving the running store. I actually just saw something Chris Johnson posted on factory defects in a shoe.
Yeah.
Recently, I think it might have been today or yesterday, but would love to dive into this and get your insight on how we can just effectively assess our shoes rather than trusting these shoes are in perfect condition. They're good to run in moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. To me, the general inspection is going to, and most of these guys, like you can do this for new shoes. You can do them for your shoes that you're already running in, like all of this stuff to kind of just check in with it. The first one, general inspection. Yeah. All we're doing is we're kind of just making sure, does everything look congruent between your right and your left shoe, right? And so obviously multiple views here. Some of the other big things that you kind of notice is I will tend to lay my shoes kind of side by side. So like so. Trying to find the camera. There we go. And what I'm doing there is you want to put them on a level surface. And so what I'm checking for there is in terms of the sole, the outsole and the midsole, does that line up between the left and the right side too? And so a quick and easy way to do that is just taking something as simple as a pin, and you, again, kind of face them so you're getting this view from your shoes, and you just drop the pin down the middle of the shoe, and you're basically checking, hey, does this match up with this other side too? And so it's a nice kind of easy way to dissect the shoe and make sure that the soles are lining up pretty well. Everything's kind of seems to be nice and stitched together pretty well. It's just a general overview of the shoe, okay? The next one I feel honestly is probably the biggest one in my opinion. It's called the insole test. And so with this one, I feel like a lot of people tend to get surprised whenever they take the insole out. And so I have them, this is usually for someone that's walking in, again, going back to the Morton's neuroma, the bunions, all that kind of stuff at the foot. I'll have them take out their insoles and I'll have them put them on the ground, and I just have them stand on them. And what we're looking for is, does that foot basically overlap the shoe of any kind? So am I seeing like this in terms of the your foot? And if that's happening in your shoe too. And so where that becomes an issue, obviously, is, again, if my foot's being bunched up and this big toe feels like it's got to do this guy, we might need to consider getting a wider toe box, okay? Some other things that you might kind of glean from that too is, and this comes to more of like a pair of shoes that you've already been running in, is where am I pushing off with most of my pressure? You can see that obviously from the bottom, but you can get a lot from that from your insole too, especially people who may tend to feel like their toes kind of claw a little bit. You're going to notice, hey, man, I'm putting a ton of pressure on this, my lateral four toes. And sometimes you can even get a little bit of a view. You can kind of see my big toe here. When that toe hits in the top of the shoe, you can see that toe go in a little bit. And this is why I like to interchange with sometimes with my Escalantes that have that wider toe box. The brake test. So the brake test for me kind of comes down to being able to see, is this a neutral shoe, a stability shoe, that sort of thing. And when we talk about the brake, all I'm asking is, we're just going to take my hands on both ends, and I'm just going to push my hands together. And you can kind of see right here is where my shoe is braking. Now, for the most part, we want that to be pretty congruent with where we're braking on what's called push-off phase of gait during our run. Reason why that's important, if we're having anything that's maybe on the top of the foot, or maybe we feel like some people get like a pinching sensation in their foot. We want to check something like that to make sure that that shoe is not the contributor of that problem, okay? Next one to me is stress test. And all that is we're just kind of taking the concept of the brake test, and now we're just really pushing this together. So I'm going to show you, obviously this is a more of a neutral type shoe. And so you can get in there a little bit more and kind of push that a little bit more to kind of get a little bit more compression. Also, I check what's called rotational stiffness as well, or torsional stiffness. And so again, this is more of a neutral everyday shoe. So it's going to have a lot more give than something like, again, your Asics and your Mizunos. They're going to be a little bit stiffer. Even going the opposite direction, like considering the brake test, like this is a New Balance Minimus. It is a minimalist type shoe. If I take that one, like I can bunch that one up pretty well. Like it just crumples up. And that's the whole point of the shoe in the first place, okay? And same thing with the stress test, like it's just got a lot more range. Another good tip, in fact, I should have said this earlier, in terms of people who are wanting to get more into a zero drop shoe, I would say with your strength training, let's start there. I would say get something like a New Balance Minimus shoe or a Vivo Barefoot to kind of get a little bit warmed up to the fact of having more of a minimalist shoe. And then the last test, The hot spots test, that is going to be more for newer shoes. And all you're doing here is you're just going inside the shoe, and I'm just checking for any signs of kind of abrasive or unenjoyable sensations in there. Sometimes with the stitching, they can kind of get it screwed up, and so it feels sharp. It just doesn't feel good on your foot. And that is something that's going to be more of a factory defect, okay? And so if that's in that shoe, then send them back.
So in terms of strength training, do you recommend, I know a lot of runners that come in day one with running shoes to do some type of lifting. Do you recommend a specific type of shoe for strength training?
Yeah, honestly, because what I typically see is they're training in running shoes. Right. So, I usually am trying to convert them pretty quickly into, again, like a New Balance Minimus or Vivo Barefoots, or if it's turf and we're not doing anything that's like too high on the acceleration deceleration spectrum, I'm okay with you going barefoot. But there again too, like if you're in season, let's ride that line safely, because I don't want you to walk out of a training session saying, oh man, my calves are on fire. That's bad news bears during your training session. Okay. And so this is why working with someone, again, like Garrett or myself, we can have that kind of constant conversation of like, hey, here's why we're doing this. And the reason why is, like, more often than not, the reason why we're giving you something like that is to get a little bit more mobility, actually, and a little bit more stability on the bottom of your foot. That's how to answer that question.
And Tammy asked specifically, is it okay to strength train in her Escalantes? Is that a shoe you'd recommend or stay away?
Me personally, I would say no. And the reason being is it's a pretty like movable shoe, meaning, and this is kind of what I hint at why I'm not like super keen on running in it all the time, is I do feel like my foot wiggles quite a bit around in that shoe. She may feel completely different. I think Ultra actually does a couple trainers that are a little bit more applicable to strength training. So Tammy, maybe look at that too.
And then going old school, Converse, Vans. I mean, I remember growing up and buying like 2 pairs of Converses for $19.99 growing up. And
you can't get $19.99 checks today, but yeah. I mean, some of the tried and true weightlifters, that's what they swear by. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Where I might have a problem with that is more along the lines of, they're not going to be as movable. They're a little more stiff in the sole. And again, kind of going back to that break test, pretty common to see like a Chuck or a Van break like right there. And that's the only place that shoe breaks. The reason why I like the Minimus shoe, because of how bendy it really is. Like you can get so much different loading patterns on your foot based on that. So if you're going to be doing more of like a heavier lifting day, totally cool with Chuck, Van. I would even say for Tammy, if you want to wear your Escalantes, that's cool. If we're going to be doing more of like a dynamic loading day, whether it's like plyos or, something along hopping, skipping, jumping, that sort of stuff, I may err on the side of, hey, let's just go ahead and invest the $80, $100 on this, because they're going to last for quite a while with you anyway.
Great information. So tell us a little bit as we start to wrap up here. Just obviously you mentioned things are a bit crazy here, been a bit crazy over the last 6 months, in person, online. How do you actually work with people?
Yeah, so it's been really cool. I felt like when everything kind of first started, I think everybody had this like, oh my God, like we're pulling our hair out. Like, what does our future look like? So for maybe like the first week, I was kind of just sitting at home, working on notes, getting a few projects done and stuff like that. But then I started to kind of market a little bit more towards online clients. And so it's helped out a little bit in terms of getting my foot in the door in other states, aka like old Michigan right there. Mm-hmm. And so it's been cool to kind of sit down with people and go through online consults. How I kind of set my onlines up. And I would say the basis for my live too, a lot of it's based on what your movement patterns look like and kind of what that story tells us into why this particular area is painful. And so we can get a pretty good lens into that just based on how you move. And so with onlines, what I typically do for the first visit is we're just kind of sitting down having a conversation. I want to know, how long it's been going on, why is it going on, all that kind of good stuff. That gives me a good frame of reference as to, hey, how's this person dealing with this injury? And what are some of the important tests that I need to send them to make sure that we have a good story of why is this happening? And so I'll email that to them. I have them shoot that with their phone or any recording device. And then they'll dump those off into basically a secure Dropbox for me. I'll pull those videos, I'll analyze them, I'll put together an email kind of template, and it kind of just explains like, hey, here's what's going on. So the next time, which is usually the day after, we'll have a follow-up session. And this is all included in the first visit. We'll have a follow-up session to go over, hey, X, Y, and Z is kind of what I saw in terms of what we need to work on. A, B, and C is kind of our strategy as far as getting those loading progressions. Over the next couple weeks, here are the goals that I want you to try to keep in mind. And then we kind of just have a continuing discussion, whether it's through email or maybe in a couple weeks, we set up a follow-up to see how everything's doing. And it's really kind of worked out pretty well as far as compliance and people recording videos and stuff like that. As far as the live stuff goes, obviously that's all going to be in real time. It's a pretty cool setup. I get about an hour and a half with someone the first time. And some of that is, hey, I'm doing a heavy subjective because again, with chronic persistent pain people, they have a lot that they want to get off on their chest, and that's completely fine with me because I think getting that emotional component out into the open is part of the battle in the first place. So with the live visits, what I usually do is we'll do subjective. I'll kind of do a set of tests and then same kind of setup. I'll say, hey, X, Y, and Z is kind of what we need to work on. And then it may range from me doing dry needling or soft tissue work, or every now and again, I'll do an adjustment or a manipulation. But for the most part, this is why the wearer of many hats, like a lot of people walk in thinking like, oh, I'm a chiropractor. He's just going to adjust everything. Not at all the case. In fact, you're probably going to walk out of my office not getting adjusted more than what you would. And the reason being is there's just not a whole lot of research that shows it's a necessity. It's more of a passive adjunct therapy that should be with the active therapy, which is the exercises. Yeah, I mean, I love what I do. I feel like every day is a puzzle or a mystery. In fact, oftentimes I've kind of worked on a couple books here lately, and I'm trying to bring the show. You're probably too young for this, Garrett. Do you know who Columbo is?
I know the name. I don't know much more than that.
So I'm trying to see if I can get everybody to be their own Columbo. He was like a TV show back in the day where it was a private detective, and he was kind of this personality type where he acted like he was completely aloof, but he always asked the right questions to figure out, what's going on.
That's awesome. I'm going to have to look it up when I get off here just to see. Yeah, that's awesome, because I was actually thinking with you, Tammy, again, Columbo was awesome. So thinking about you being a sports chiropractor and seeing a lot of your posts too on movements versus manipulation and how a lot more retraining, exercise progressions, those kinds of things. Are you seeing a change in how the chiropractic profession is moving overall, or?
Great question, Garrett. Fingers crossed, I hope so. Main reason being is it's not necessarily a gripe to the profession of chiropractic, but I would say, as a spectrum, we kind of have people on one side that are more of the traditional chiropractor based on philosophy. And there's a lot more kids coming out of school now that are a lot more science-based and evidence-based rehab kind of principles. So they're a little bit more active therapy and that sort of thing. And so I'm just trying to be a vessel to help with the people on that end, because when you, at least for myself, like when I got out of school, I didn't have a whole lot of people that I could necessarily shadow and follow their philosophy on. And so it's kind of my mission. And honestly, that's part of what the modern day chiro is too, is to help provide that backdrop for other kids or even just doctors who are throwing their hands up in the air and saying like, I hate what I do. I want to do something different. I want to provide them a better way and a more modern approach to be able to deal with that.
Awesome. Yeah, great to understand too from your viewpoint. And so how can, I'll throw the slide up here, and if you can just kind of, before we get into the Q&A, so those of you that are hanging out here, feel free to start dropping some questions. There are a few questions I still need to get to in the Q&A, but what's the best way for people to contact you?
Yeah, a couple different emails. Most of what I deal with, if we end up working together in some capacity, jesse@moderndaychiro.com. My other email that I work with is jesseriley.dc@gmail. Website is moderndaychiro.com. I'm pretty active on Instagram. That would probably be my biggest platform. You can find me there at Doc Jesse Riley. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, but I'll be honest, like Twitter is mainly more for my own enjoyment, following whatever's on Twitter. And then Facebook is mainly more of reposting whatever I post on Instagram.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get to a few questions here. I have a couple that I didn't ask as we were getting through the content. Let's see. All right, let's start down the list here. And those of you hanging out here, feel free to add another question. I'm going to ask those that I missed already. So if I already missed that, I'll be getting that right now. If there's anything new, drop it in there. Tammy, I was actually having trouble with the ball of my right foot, right foot really getting sore after 3 miles. So any shoe considerations for feeling that soreness there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely, Tammy, I would say first test is going to be that insole test. And then I would probably say general inspection is probably the next one. Checking those two to see like, hey, am I generating a lot more pressure on that area of my foot than anywhere else? Next suggestion might be, and you could check the brake test in terms of making sure that where the brake in the shoe is applicable to kind of where you're pushing off. But I would say that the insole test and the general inspection are going to be your two biggies. You said you are, if I remember correctly, Tammy, you said that you were the Newton gal. And so one big thing there is we obviously know that you're going to adopt more of a 4-foot type foot strike. And so that can generate a lot more pressure into that ball of your foot. What I might suggest is for the time being, you don't have to just throw your Newtons away, but you may want to hop into another shoe that may take that load strategy away. And I know this sounds crazy, but a lot of times whenever we change up cadence or our step rate and the terrain that we run too, sometimes that can help as well. But this sounds to me more like, in my humble opinion, that you might need to just change your foot strike for a little while to relieve some pain.
Okay, awesome. And so Yukio had a question. Would I get more room in a toe box with a larger shoe? I'm wearing New Balance 880. They are 2 weeks old. I have wide feet. New Balance changed the model and narrowed the toe box in this version. As a result of my last long run, 18 miles, the front of my toes hurt on my foot with the bunion. No store in the it carries 2E. If I went up half size, would it make a difference?
Yukio, I feel for you, man. So the question, I want to make sure I'm reiterating this correctly. He said that his new shoes are too wide?
Too narrow. So would I get more room in a toe box with a larger size? So she says she naturally has wider feet.
Okay, got it.
Now too narrow. So I wonder if going up in a size would help that.
Not going to necessarily give you a wider toe box. That might be Yukio. I might suggest this might be a case where going to local running store or having someone who is a little bit more of a professional there locally helping you out with that process, because you're definitely fitting into a category. And this is kind of the misconception with when we order a wide shoe, is it's wide throughout the whole shoe, not just the toe box. I think a lot of people tend to think like, oh, I get a wide shoe, I have a wide toe box. Well, you do, but you also get wide everything else too. So there's a lot more room for that foot to kind of move around everywhere else, which is not inherently good either. So what I might suggest, Yukio, is maybe seeing a couple different suggestions. First off would be trying to find running store there locally to kind of help you out with that, to see if they can maybe find a better suggestion for you. New Balance 880s are pretty on the stability type shoe side. They're a little more stiffer too. So having something like that to be able to try on in real time is probably going to be widely beneficial. The second suggestion, if that's not the case, you don't have a locals running store, then I would probably hop onto Running Warehouse, and that's where I might check out the Topo athletic shoes, because if I recall, the 880s are going to be on the relatively higher end of the shoe drop spectrum too. So I don't think necessarily going to an Ultra would be the best idea either. So maybe hopping into the Topo realm might be the best option in terms of ordering online. But first suggestion would be trying to find somebody locally that can kind of help you out with that a little bit more.
And any difference or opinion on putting women and men's running shoes for a wider toe box?
It's actually not a terrible idea at all. I mean, just because no human being has a textbook foot based on gender, right? It doesn't. Your foot size has no gender roles or barriers. So for me, it's more, in fact, I think that's a great suggestion, Garrett. Even Yukio, if that is an option for you too, you might try that route as well.
Awesome. She got them from Fleet Feet. She'll make another trip number 3 tomorrow, so she appreciates the suggestions. So Jen asks, and I guess I want to kind of piggyback on this, best lifting shoe for high arches. And then there's always this verbiage on, I have low arches, I have high arches, whether that being good or bad. So could you, I guess, elaborate? Is there any research on showing those are they a problem in any way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say this from the research standpoint, and I'll also say from just personal experience in terms of clients that I've worked with. Whenever we have, most of the research basically is what I'm trying to say, there isn't really a specific shoe type for a foot type, if that makes sense. Most of the research that they found is whatever running shoe in, there was zero correlation with that reducing injury rate. So what I usually suggest, however, and you actually find this more often than not, is people naturally adopt it anyway, is a person who has something like that, they usually going to pick a stiffer shoe, mainly for the being that whenever that foot lands, especially in mid stance, and we're getting that arch to kind of drop down a little bit, you want something there that's kind of helping that slow that process down. So the pronation element. And so what I might suggest in terms of lifting shoes, again, I might suggest more of like a CrossFit Metcon shoe, or what is it? Is it the Nike Metcons that I'm thinking of? Or is that the Reebok ones, the Metcon?
I'm not sure.
Either way, so either of those type of workout shoes are going to be pretty good. They're a little stiffer. You may actually have, as far as the Converse goes, usually the Chucks are pretty like narrow shoe. So if that's a concern with you, then I might not go that route. But if it's not, then a Van or a Chuck is a little stiffer as well. So that might help you. As far as the Minimus goes, the New Balance Minimus that you guys saw earlier, like this guy here, I think it's okay. But again, I don't know that I would suggest you doing that for like a hard workout effort either. You may want to warm up into that just to make sure that we're not overloading the arch, or maybe that posterior tib tendon along the inside of your shin too.
Okay, awesome. And then last question. So if anyone else has a final question, feel free to drop it in there now. What are your overall thoughts on barefoot and minimalist running shoes on injury prevention?
In short, I think that there is no correlation whatsoever. I actually think more often than not, I see more people who have got into that shoe and got injured than really the opposite. And that's why, to me, like, it's always going to be this spectrum of this versus this, or that versus that. I think that the minimalist type shoes have their place. And I think you would agree with this too, Garrett. The reason being is it's just helping you load that foot a little bit more. So what was it? Was it Leah, the one that was talking about the arch stuff? Like that might be something to where, again, wearing that type of shoe may help load your foot a little bit more and make it a little bit more robust. But again, it's just like with everything else. I don't wake up day one of my marathon plan by running marathon. You got to work your way up into that. And so even with something like the minimalist shoe type craze, I'm definitely not going to suggest that person just get right back in the swing of things with the minimalist type shoe. There's definitely going to be a grace period.
Awesome. No, that sounds great. Yeah, well, we appreciate you sharing this information with us today. I am going to, everyone that's on here still, I'm going to send you an email tomorrow at 11 a.m. with the replay of the Fireside Chat today. Dr. Riley's contact information in there. So if you have any questions for him, definitely look around the website, jump on Instagram for sure. Great information, and I think we'll be entertained in the process. It's pretty funny stuff. But that's it for tonight. Dr. Riley, I appreciate you taking some time with us on this Monday evening. And everyone else, thanks for joining on in this Fireside Chat.
Yeah, thanks guys so much for coming. Garrett, obviously, thanks again for having me. Always good to see you, buddy.
Thank you. Have a great night.